This weekend is a weekend that we set aside to remember and reflect upon what is maybe the high point and the low point of the gospel message. Today is Good Friday. This is a day that we set aside to remember and reflect upon maybe the low point, which is the death of Jesus. And on Easter Sunday, we will celebrate what is the high point when Jesus is raised from the dead. But in another sense, really, this entire weekend is the high point of our faith. As much as it is important for us to enter into the horrors of the crucifixion and to think about all that Jesus endured on our behalf, there is a reason why we call this day Good Friday. And as we think about what it is that makes this Good Friday, I want to just begin by sharing with you a few of my favorite scenes in what are a few of my favorite books. The first one is found in The Count of Monte Cristo. Count of Monte Cristo was written by Alexander Dumas in the 1800s. They made it into a movie in 2002 that I think still holds up pretty well if you're looking for something to watch this weekend. The Count of Monte Cristo is a story about love and betrayal and friendship and revenge, but there is a part of that story that I had never really noticed until we watched it again as a family this past summer. Now, the Count of Monte Cristo revolves around the story of Edmond Dantes. On the eve of his wedding to the love of his life, Edmond Dantes is suddenly arrested and thrown into prison. He's actually taken and transferred to the Chateau d'If, which was a famous island prison located on the Mediterranean Sea. It was kind of like a 16th century Alcatraz. There was no escape from this prison, and even if you could somehow manage to escape the prison walls, you would have to deal with the heavy offshore currents of the sea. So it was the perfect setting to highlight the hopeless situation of Edmond Dantes. Dantes spends years in that prison, and as far as we know, or as far as the story tells us, there's only one other prisoner being held there at the time, a priest who was thought to be crazy by the guards. But as it turns out, that priest was not crazy, and he befriends Edmond Dantes and teaches him many things, how to read and how to write, among other things. And one of the other things that the two start doing together is digging a tunnel out of the prison. They work at this for months, maybe years, it's not exactly clear, but then just when they literally begin to see light at the end of the tunnel, it collapses and the priest is killed. And at that point of the story, all hope seems lost. There's no way out of the prison now, and his one and only companion has died. But it is the death of that priest that allows Edmond Dantes to escape from prison. Because he strikes upon an idea. He drags the priest back to his cell, places him on his bunk, and makes it look as if he has simply died in his sleep of natural causes. When the priest doesn't answer the call for mealtime, the guards enter his cell. They find him dead. They place him in a body bag and leave him to be disposed of later. And it is then that Edmond Dantes slips back into the priest's cell and trades places with him. The priest dies, and Dantes finds his freedom. Now, actually, if you stop to think about it, that is a recurring theme in literature. We find it all over the place, this theme of one person taking the place of another. It's something embedded in our consciences. It's something that resonates with our being. It's a theme of substitution. A similar thing happens in Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment. The protagonist of that story is a man named Raskolnikov. And the story is that he has committed murder. He's murdered a local pawnbroker, and he's tried to cover up his crime. But there is a relentless detective who is pursuing him at his heels and has a suspicion, at least, that Raskolnikov is the guy guilty of this murder. And so at one point, he's brought into the police station for questioning. And just at the moment that it looks like his guilt is about to be uncovered, something totally unexpected happens. A stranger walks into the police station and confesses to that very murder. And the police have no choice but to set Raskolnikov free. The innocent is condemned and the guilty goes free. In Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities, it actually ends with a very, very similar thing happening. Amid the horrors of the French Revolution, during the deadly days of the guillotine, the French patriot Charles Darnay is condemned to die. But an Englishman by the name of Sidney Carton has a plan to save him. The two men are similar in appearance. And in the hour before his execution was to take place, Carton suddenly shows up in Darnay's prison cell to exchange clothes and positions. He will go to the guillotine and die in the other man's place. The innocent is executed while the condemned goes free. Now, I probably should have given you a spoiler alert because I just kind of ruined the plot twist of all of those stories. But since the most recent of them was written more than 100 years ago, too bad. Now, I don't want this to become your high school English literature class, but there is something profound in each of those stories. I love all of those stories, especially those scenes or those moments where there's this twist that happens. Stories are compelling and surprising, but I want to say to you that there is a better story. And it is, in fact, the story that all of these stories come from. It is the story of the gospel. And the good news about this story is that this story is true. The good news of Good Friday is that Jesus, the only true and innocent one, traded places with us so that we might go free. The good news of Good Friday is that through the death of our high priest, we are given life. The good news of Good Friday is that though we were guilty and condemned to death, Jesus stepped forward and traded places with us. Now, there are lots of things that we could say on Good Friday, but I want to stick with this theme of the innocent being condemned and the guilty being set free. And I want to do that by turning your attention to a familiar, but I think overlooked story from the final week of Jesus' life. The story is actually found in Matthew and Mark and Luke. We're going to read the account as we find it in the Gospel of Matthew. We're picking it up after Jesus has been arrested, and the various officials of the day are trying to figure out what to do with him. And this is what it says. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released for them Barabbas, and having Jesus scourged, delivered him to be crucified. Now, if we were doing an in-depth study of this passage, it might be good for us to look at all of the characters that we meet in this scene. We could look at Pilate and his futile attempt to wash the guilt off of his hands in the death of Jesus. Or we could look at the crowd and the role that they played as they shouted, "Crucify him," and the role they played in the execution of Jesus. And if we looked closely at the crowd, we might even find ourselves among them. But for our purposes today, I think it's helpful to focus our attention just on the two characters of Jesus and Barabbas. Jesus is the innocent prisoner. Verse 18 tells us that Pilate knows the only reason that the religious leaders have handed Jesus over to him is because he knew they were envious of Jesus' increasing popularity. And Pilate's own wife has this horrifying dream and is troubled by it, and so she tells her husband, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man." And then when we read this same story in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him." And then later in that same chapter, it says, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." Jesus is innocent. He is the only innocent one who ever lived. There was no basis for arresting him. There was no reason for him to be tried before Pilate. And even when he is tried, Pilate finds no basis for the charges that have been leveled against him. He committed no crime. No deceit was found in his mouth. And if not for all of the political entrapment, Pilate would have dismissed the case as absolutely frivolous. Jesus is innocent, but Barabbas was guilty. He's described here as a notorious criminal. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us exactly how it was that Barabbas gained his notoriety, but Mark and Luke fill those gaps in for us. So Luke recounts it like this. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas." And then here's Luke's parenthetical comment. "A man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He was a rebel leader intent on toppling the government, and it didn't matter if human life stood in the way of that. When Peter preaches a sermon before a group of Jewish religious leaders, he says this, "But you denied the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you." Barabbas was guilty. He knew it. Pilate knew it. Everyone knew it. The governor had a custom in those days to release one prisoner, sort of like a presidential pardon. And he could either release the innocent Jesus or the guilty Barabbas. And being a savvy politician, Pilate decides to put this to a vote. And he eventually goes along with the wishes of the crowd. He releases Barabbas and condemns Jesus to death. Jesus was crucified between two criminals. Most likely, he took the spot intended for Barabbas, the ringleader of the group. Now, in one sense, the story of Barabbas is just another example of the many injustices that took place during Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. But in another sense, it typifies what the gospel is about. And we see it in this contrast between Jesus and Barabbas. Interestingly, the name Barabbas means son of the Father. But we know who the real son of the Father is in the story, and it's Jesus. In fact, we would probably be pretty hard-pressed to find a greater contrast between two people than the one between Jesus and Barabbas. J.C. Ryle commented on the contrast in this way: the one was a sinner against God and man, a malefactor stained with many crimes. The other was the holy, harmless, and undefiled Son of God, in whom there was no fault at all. Now, there's lots of injustice in our world, and we could simply conclude this is just one more example of it. But there is more to the story than that. One commentator put it this way: Barabbas does not stand before us merely as an individual. He represents at the same time the human race in its present condition, as fallen from God in a state of rebellion against divine majesty, bound in the fetters of the curse of the law until the day of judgment. See, like Barabbas, we are everything that Jesus is not: sinful, selfish, rebellious against the rule of God. And our sin imprisons us and will not let us go. Even worse, the law of God that we have broken condemns us under his wrath. Like Barabbas, we are waiting on death row, for the penalty of sin is death, and after that, eternal punishment. So imagine the surprise Barabbas got that day. He's been sentenced to death, and he knows that he deserves it. He's just waiting for the guards to come and for him to make that last fateful walk before his execution. But instead, he is released and set free. And Jesus takes his place. Jesus dies the death he deserved to die. Think about this exchange. Jesus and Barabbas trade places. The murderer's bonds, his curse, his disgrace, his mortal agony are all transferred to the righteous Jesus, while the liberty, the innocence, the safety, and the well-being of Jesus are transferred to Barabbas. Now, we don't have evidence that Barabbas became a follower of Jesus as a result of this, but I think as we read his story, we are supposed to stop and ponder our own story. As we read his story, we're supposed to stop and think about how Jesus has traded places with us as well. How he has taken our punishment for our crimes and our rebellion against God. How he has died the death we deserve to die. The good news of Good Friday is that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The good news of Good Friday is that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. Now, earlier I told you about the way this type of exchange happened in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. The scene that happens immediately after that exchange between the two individuals is that after Carton trades places with Charles Darnay, he's transferred, along with others, to his public execution. And one of the people that he meets is an innocent young seamstress who is also condemned to die. But she had previously met Charles Darnay, and so she recognizes that this man must be an imposter. And yet instantly she guesses at what he is doing. Are you dying for him? She wonders. And as she wonders and thinks about his costly sacrifice, she is reminded about Christ's costly sacrifice. And clutching his hand, she says, I have been able to raise my thoughts to him who was put to death, that we might have hope and comfort. And that's exactly what we're supposed to do as we consider this story. It's to raise our thoughts to him who was put to death in our place, that we might have comfort and hope. The reason the gospel is good news, the reason this is Good Friday, is because this good news comes to us while we're on death row, in the prison of our fallen nature with no possibility of escape. We're like Edmond Dantes, trapped in a prison with no way out. We're like Raskolnikov, not just suspected of a crime, but guilty of it. We're like Charles Darnay, facing certain judgment unless someone comes forward and takes our place. And what makes the gospel good news is that this is precisely what Jesus has done. The cross declares that God has an answer or a way to deal with the problem of our sin, and that answer is Jesus. There's a letter that circulated in the early church. It was written in the early part of the 2nd century. It's known as the Epistle to Diognetus. Here's how that letter describes this exchange that we are invited to participate in. He himself took on the burden of our iniquities. He gave his own Son as a ransom for us, the Holy One for transgressors, the blameless one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the incorruptible one for the corruptible, the immortal one for them that are mortal. For what other thing was capable of covering our sins than his righteousness? By what other one was it possible that we, the wicked and ungodly, could be justified than by the only Son of God? Oh, sweet exchange. Oh, unsearchable operation. Oh, benefits surpassing all expectation, that the wickedness of many should be hid in a single righteous one, and that the righteousness of one should justify many transgressors. This is the exchange that happened on Good Friday. And long before the epistle to Diognetus was written, God promised what this great exchange would look like. Listen to these familiar words from Isaiah the prophet as he spoke about the coming Messiah, or the Messiah who was to come. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That's what makes Good Friday good. It's that we are invited to participate in this great exchange where Jesus takes our place and we take his place. And we're going to close this morning with a time of communion together. Just want to give you some instructions around that. I want to first read for you the way we find the instructions. Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" We're going to do that this morning. What we're going to do this morning is the band's going to come and play, and that will give us a couple moments on our own just for quiet reflection to think about the significance of this. Think about the significance of what Jesus has done for us by taking our place. And then when the band begins to sing, you can come forward and participate in communion. If you have accepted his substitution on your behalf, we invite you to do that by coming forward, taking bread, which represents his body, and dipping it in the wine or the juice, which represents his blood.